As we go along, we're going to categorize, as was mentioned earlier, our perennials on the basis of whether they prefer sun or whether they prefer shade. However, I would like to address just certain general principles about choosing plants in general. So my motto is, and I think many gardeners, is right plant, right place. And there's a number of, may I have the next slide, please? Yeah. Number of different factors that go into the right plant and the right place. And the first is knowing our hardiness zones. In Fairfax County, we are located in zone 7A, although parts of the county that are maybe more western may be a little colder, parts of the county that are further into the city may be a little warmer. But we're basically 7A. We also have to consider microclimates on our property where maybe our garden is close to our house and there's a little bit of heat that part of the garden might get, then plants in that area might get, as opposed to something that's further out in a field, for instance, that doesn't have any protection. So those are called microclimates, and they sometimes allow you to kind of play with the zone a little bit. Most of the vendors in this area obviously only sell plants that are appropriate for this zone, but it does become important if you're looking at mail ordering plants, because those companies service the entire country. So you always want to make sure before you order that beautiful looking plant from the catalog that it's appropriate for your zone. The next issue I'd like to address, if I could have the next slide, please, is light, which I consider to be probably the most important feature when choosing plants. You'll see on the plant tag that it says full sun, shade, part sun, and full sun, as the slide says, is 6 or more hours of direct sunlight per day. Shade is less than 4, part sun 4 to 6. Morning sun is less intense than the afternoon heat of the day sun. And so many plants that are labeled as shade will do well in morning sun. In fact, many gardeners consider morning sun to be shade. So you may have to experiment a little bit, but and you'll find some plants that absolutely have to have full sun and are not going to tolerate part shade. Lavender, rosemary, for instance. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about moisture. And that's something that if you're out and about in your garden and your yard, you're going to see pretty quickly. If you have an area located between large shade trees, you're going to have probably dry shade. Your soil is going to be dry. If your garden is located perhaps at the bottom of a slope or a bottom of the hill in your backyard, it may tend to collect moisture in that area and be a little bit more wet. So you want to make sure that you know whether your plant is adaptable to either dry shade or a moist area. I'd like to talk about soil as well. And what you're seeing in this slide is a soil test kit. This measures pH, which is a gauge of acidity, alkalinity, also reveals nutrient deficiencies and allows you to amend your soil accordingly. Now, most of the soils in this Northern Virginia area are pretty compacted clay soils. And while clay soils have good nutrients, the fact that they're so compacted is sometimes very hard for roots to get established. So when you're planting little perennials, you may want to consider amending your soil with compost, which will break down and improve the texture of your soil as well as add nutrients. I know on existing gardens, many gardeners will just go around and top dress with compost and let the worms do the rest, because they will incorporate that compost into the soil and improve it over time. The soil test kits are available, COVID notwithstanding, through the extension office, which I understand is open for the purpose of maybe picking up a soil test kit. And correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone knows differently. I know most Fairfax County libraries stock the soil test kits, and again, their openness is variable. I don't know if you were to call ahead and ask them to bring one to you in your car, if they would do that. And also a lot of the larger garden centers will stock these soil test kits. The directions for how to actually collect the soil and where to send it are included in the kit. So I think that's pretty important to kind of assess the soil before you're planting something. The next slide addresses my favorite, and this is from my own backyard. Critters. Do you have deer? Do you have rabbits? When I first joined the Master Gardener program, I was just amazed at how every time we discussed a new plant, the first question that was asked was, do the deer like it? Well, now that I have my own herd of 9 deer, I get it. They have already chewed the emerging foliage on my daylilies so far this year. And I try and spray every 2 to 3 weeks. I have found several sprays that are quite effective. However, you need to realize that if the deer are really hungry, they're just going to eat it. Now, they don't like aromatic plants. They don't like fuzzy plants. So that may help. And I have tried to maybe put a rosemary or some lamb's ear in front of things that they do like. My experience has been that they just step right over the lamb's ear and go for the lilies. But you do need to deal with deer and rabbits. And again, repellents are the best way. Some people have fences, and I'm jealous because then I could have all the hostas that I want. However, and then lastly, I'd like to talk just briefly about toxicity. Here's everybody's favorite poison ivy. If you're living in a wooded area, you need to know what that looks like. And also, if you have small children or pets, you need to know that, certain plants are highly toxic. And if your dog likes to chew on plants or dig in the garden, and you'd want to familiarize yourself with whether that plant that you would like to buy is toxic to pets or humans. And the old adage is leaves of 3, leave them be, because the poison ivy plant has very distinctive leaves of 3. And then lastly, and I'm sorry I don't have a slide about this, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about when you choose a plant, integrating the plants to your current garden or even starting a new garden. You want to know when that plant blooms, and when you site it, what are you going to put it next to? And when does the neighbor plant bloom? And what color are the blooms? If they bloom together, are those colors compatible? You want to know the mature height of the plant. Generally, taller plants in the back, mid, lower, maybe a ground cover in the front. But that's not a hard and fast rule. There are some lovely see-through plants out there called see-through plants like Gora that could go maybe more to the front of the garden, and you would still see the back. But those are all things that you want to consider when you see that plant at the garden center that you just can't pass up. Where are you going to put it? As we talked earlier, perennials usually only bloom for 2 to 3 weeks. And then if you cut off the dead flowers, if you deadhead it, sometimes it will send up fresh blooms. But if it doesn't, and basically you're left with the texture of the leaf from the plant that's finished blooming. So how does that play with its neighbors? It's sometimes nice to have contrasts in texture, maybe a big leafed plant next to a feathery leafed plant. So you want to consider the texture when you're thinking about a plant. And lastly, you want to consider maintenance. What's involved in taking care of this plant? Do you need to stake it? Is it a lily? Is it a dahlia that's going to need to be staked? People say, I want a really no maintenance garden, and there's no such thing, as most gardeners know, but there are different degrees of maintenance. So you need to figure out what your tolerance for, you know, cutting back and staking and digging up, and at the end of the season, for instance, dahlias, and are you willing to do that? So these are all things that general considerations when you're choosing a plant. And now we get to the really fun part where we're going to see sun perennials and shade perennials. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. Laura, are there any questions in the chat for Jean?
There are not.
All right. So today in our neighbor to neighbor chat, we will now talk about flowering plants for sunny locations. And at the end of each presentation, we'll take a minute for questions. So Terry, I will turn this over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Jean, for all of those, your insights this evening. I always love hearing from other fellow gardeners about their approach to these things. And of course, it is a lifelong endeavor to develop our gardens to have season-long, and I'd like to say year-long interest and activities. And my message to add to yours is that we should all be patient with ourselves and patient with our gardens, because some things just don't work out. And I think it's always a process of revisiting choices from the past sometimes, a lot of trial and error. And for me to add to get to that sense that I'm accomplishing that year-round interest, I make a point of taking pictures of vignettes or corners or special vantage points that are important to me, like from my kitchen window or my driveway or my front door, and then trying to say, okay, what is in bloom this time of year that now I could kind of give it a little punch if this is a vignette that I want to cultivate. So anyway, that's my impromptu lead in now specifically to flowers for sunny area. This slide is to Jean's very point, is that for year-round or season-full blooms, we could be talking about and should be talking about considering bulbs, shrubs, your annuals, too much to go over for 5 minutes. So I too am focusing on herbaceous plants for tonight, and I hope you will enjoy this 5-minute whirlwind review of eye candy of potentials. I've chosen 5 plants that are natives. Caitlin is going to be focusing later and making further comments about natives. And I noticed that she and I have even chosen some similar plants, or the same plants, I should say, even for shade, which shows you some plants are very versatile that way. But I wanted to have 5 native plants that are that I've seen do very well in sunny sites, and then 5 rock solid options that are non-natives but have really worked well here in Northern Virginia for me. So thank you. All right, my first eye candy for you is Pachyra aurea, which is otherwise known as golden ragwort. And this is a great plant. It's versatile, doing well in conditions of full sun to full shade, like I said. But I have it as a sunny plant because that is where I found it to thrive and excel as an early spring pop of color. So this is just out there when there's not a lot else going on, and it's a great plant. I will say though, beware, this hardy plant can be toxic to humans and animals if consumed. So please consider it carefully when you plant it. Next is Coreopsis verticillata, apologizing. And it's another fun pop of yellow for your late spring. Early garden. It's got intriguing feathery foliage, talking about the importance of foliage that Jean mentioned. And with mid-season shearing, you'd be rewarded with additional blooms lasting into August. So that's another one for you to consider. Next. One of my favorites, but I know some people think this is a weed, is Asclepias tuberosa, otherwise known as butterfly weed. And this starts you into later summer. This slide notes that the blooming season is from May to September, but I find it blooms most often on the later side of that range, more like August and into September. And it's a resilient plant doing well near roadsides or other difficult areas for plants to grow. And it attracts butterflies like its name suggests. But the plant also serves as a micro food web for other insects, such as the milkweed bugs or oleander aphids, which both support other beneficial birds and insects in your garden. So, and the feathery seed pods from this plant, when it goes to seed, are a lot of fun. So another really great plant, a very resilient native. Next is the Lilium superbum. And as summer continues, lilies emerge throughout their gardens, and the Lilium superbum, or the Turk's cap lily, is an intriguing native option. And under the right conditions, most notably well-drained soil, this can be a very prolific bloomer. And however, it is not at all drought tolerant. So care must be given to making sure this has adequate water throughout the growing season. Next. And everybody, at least I love, once again, Rudbeckia fulgida. There are so many of the varieties of this out there, and they're all very resilient. In fact, some people, again, can think of this as an invasive if they seed, since they seed so efficiently. But I just love my black-eyed Susies. I have them up and down a white picket fence in the front of my house. So again, it's very resilient right out there on the roadside, and it has a great long-lasting pop of color. The only issue I've ever had with Rudbeckia is the fungus, which can darken the leaves so that they can look dry or dying. But to manage this, earlier on, I periodically trim up the foliage from the ground so the fungus spores don't splash up on the new leaves, and the new leaves grow out healthy, and the flowers still look great. So that's how I manage that. And I love seeing the goldfinches and the other animals, other birds who really eat these seeds and enjoy it. Okay, now I'm going to go quickly on to five non-natives that just seem to do really well in sun. Phlox subulata, or carpet phlox is a really easy plant to grow, and it again comes in real early. It's right in now, blooming, and it comes in all kinds of colors: white, pale violet, fuchsia. So it's a great springtime pop of color while other of your plants really get going. Next, this is another one, Hyberus sempervirens. And I don't have any of this at the moment, but I plan to add this to my front beds by my driveway. So just talking about that same idea of this time of year, wanting a little brightness in that area, which is very dark right now, or it has light, but there's no color. So I'm hoping, and I have planted the snowflake bulbs there, which did give me a little earlier, even earlier white. And now I want this to be coming out after it as another pop of white. Okay, now this is Salvia sylvestris. Now coming into later spring, early June, I think every garden should have some salvia somewhere. There are, again, so many varieties of salvia now, but I am a big fan of May Night. It reliably blooms just in that sweet spot after many of the early spring bloomers are done, but before the full summer glory of August blooming flowers arrive. So I have this blooming up against some dwarf acarus. So there's a great greenish yellow contrast to this purple, and it comes in just as you're celebrating Father's Day. So that's great. And then coming to the end of the season, everybody needs asters. And my last two things here for the end of season. So asters are in August and September, and any of them that are in the wood series are really very reliable choices. Easy to split and transplant, and I love asters. And lastly, but not least, is chrysanthemums. And we're not talking about the chrysanthemums that are out there and that people plop in the ground. We're talking about perennials. And so these can bloom well into November and into December if you've pruned them in the season to extend the blooms. So I periodically prune back this plant beginning in mid-April until the 4th of July. And it does mean you're cutting off early developing buds, which can kind of be painful, but no fears, the plant pushes out more buds. And you'll also find that you'll have shorter plants, which are more firm rather than flopping to the ground. So I hope you have enjoyed this quick tour through Sunnyside plants for full season blooming potential. My resources for pictures and plant facts are noted here. And now I will pass the presentation back to, see if there's any questions.
Were there any questions for Terry in the chat box?
Nope, no questions in the chat box.
All right, so next we will move ahead to Caitlin's presentation about flowers for partial shade.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin McKeegan, and I am an intern master gardener. I'm going to walk you through some of the perennials that I really like for shade. As Terry previewed, I tend to lean towards natives because they support, lots of wildlife, and I just really like watching all of that activity in my yard. So I will walk you through my suggestions. Unlike Terry, I did not exercise restraint. So we will go through many plants, but I will go pretty quickly. And then of course we will have time for questions at the end. Next slide, please. So in preparing for this presentation, of course, the plants needed to be perennials, that they needed to be suitable for shade. I took this to be kind of, part shade. We don't have a whole lot of really deep shaded areas in, our suburban locations, but, certainly if anyone has any questions about deep shade plants, I can, take those at the end. And then personally, when I plant things, I want them to be really fun to look at. I think gardening should be fun. It should be immersive. It should draw you in. You put all that work into things. And I really appreciated Terry talking about vantage points from her house because, it's easy to put things around your foundation, but then you never see them when you're sitting in your house. And I love to look out my window and see the birds, like she said, birds on black-eyed Susans and things like that. So whether you have to get up close to see them or, you can see them from a distance, they should be fun. And then the other thing that I really love to do is walk through my garden and just see what's on the plants. So if the plants themselves, they're all beautiful, but I really like to see the bees and the butterflies, and sometimes I'll walk past plants and I'll show you a little bit later. They're just crawling with life, and it's just the coolest thing. So a couple other notes. I have chosen some rather enthusiastic plants that spread. So if you're a little bit worried about, I'll note those as we go through. So if you're worried about, taking over your space, maybe avoid those. But if you're like me and you have lots of space to fill and your budget is limited, choose these plants because they will help you out. And then these are plants that I have in my own garden, or like Terry said, she has one that she's planning to add this year. As I was going through this presentation, I was like, oh, I want to add that. So they're things that I personally plan to use or have used and have experience with. Next slide, please. So again, Terry kind of previewed this for me. I know I have 5 minutes and I'm probably going to go over. I'm going to try to be really concise here. Native plants, you can give a whole lecture on why native plants. But for me, I really love that they support, food webs. I was lucky enough to hear Doug Tallamy speak. He's an entomologist from Delaware, and he has written several really wonderful books if you're interested in this area. And he asked everyone in the audience at a lecture, he's like, you guys like bird watching? We're all like, yeah, of course. Who doesn't like watching birds? And he was like, well, if you want to have birds, they need to have stuff to eat. So, Terry said that a lot of people consider butterfly weed to be a weed, but it feeds monarch caterpillars, and we love monarch butterflies, and birds love to eat caterpillars. So those plants are really important. So native plants support the entire food web. They help, we had a lot of presentations in our Master Gardener program about how incorporating at least some native plants in your landscape will help your other plants that may be non-native be more resilient to pests. And then, Jean was really great and walked us through planting in the proper zone and things like that. Native plants are designed to grow here, and they still require some maintenance. They're a little bit lower maintenance, and they're really well adapted. My plants, I have the most compacted of compacted clay soil, and they've done really well here because that's what they're designed to grow in. Okay, so without further ado, we'll go on to the pretty pictures. Next slide, please. So, where we are right now, the ephemerals are just wrapping up. I don't know about you, but, by the time we hit March, I am just desperate for any color. Feels like winter is never going to end. And of course, I had to feature two of Virginia's most beloved ephemerals, the Spring Beauty and Virginia Bluebells. They pop up, give you a bright burst of color. I mean, they're relatively low profile. And then they go back down when it gets hot, vanish, and they'll just sleep until next spring. So you can put two things in the same spot, which is really nice. Terry was wonderful and went through Latin names. I am not going to even attempt to speak to Latin names. I've indicated those on my slides, but I'm using common names just to not totally trip over myself. So if you go to the next slide, there are two other spring ephemerals that I really like and might not be, put in gardens quite so often. But this kind of fills one of those things, like a conversational plant. One is Dutchman's breeches, which has that very iconic shape. They look like, pantaloons hanging on a clothesline. And that's just so cool to walk by those and see, like, the name is going to stick in your head because there's something really cool to see. Just really beautiful plant. And then the other relative of Dutchman's breeches is the native bleeding heart. So, we see a lot of those in cultivation, through nurseries, but there is a native bleeding heart. I think it's called fringed bleeding heart, Dicentra exemia. This is why I'm not trying to speak Latin, but it has the same beautiful flower. So if you have space for that, maybe consider planting that one instead of the nursery trade. And just as an example or an anecdote, as I was putting together these slides, I was like, to my husband, I said, hey, look at this picture of Dutchman's breeches. Aren't they funny? And he laughed, and he was like, that's delightful. And I was like, exactly. So include these in your garden. Next slide, please. This is, as we head into early summer, well, late spring, early summer, this is a plant that Terry had featured too, golden ragwort. I have this in full sun and I have it in part shade. It is equally vigorous in both places. And it's always just this, like, again, once the ephemerals I have a few here and there, but the ragwort is really the first distinct pop of color in my garden. And, early pollinators really love it. It's in the aster family, and bees and pollinators just go bananas for anything in the aster family. So it's a really great plant to put in. It also will outcompete some invasive plants that we're trying to get rid of. So I have plans to expand my golden ragwort empire into, some English ivy that I have that I'm trying to, beat back. And it has really nice leaves, so it's a great ground cover. Even when it's done blooming, it has some interest that remains. Next slide, please. And then once we truly get into early summer, I love St. John's wort, and this particular one with those bees love anything that has that kind of fuzzy, and this is where I betray my master gardener knowledge, but any of these fuzzy plants, they just like, you'll see them like crawl around in there and kind of, have a little party. And St. John's wort is nice because it's a perennial, but it's shrubby. So, and it has, mine are partially evergreen. So it gives you some like, full season interest. Even when it's done blooming, you'll have something kind of architectural and colorful to look at. And mine blooms for a fairly, a couple weeks when it finally blooms. Next slide, please. Another one that I really love is Baptisia. There are a couple different native varieties in Virginia. One is the blue variety that we see a lot of, blue false indigo. And then there is Baptisia tinctoria, which is the yellow wild indigo. The reason I had to borrow a picture of yellow indigo and couldn't use one from my garden is that mine is very young. These take a long time to establish. And so it keeps coming back up every year. It's a little bit bigger every year, but my wild indigo hasn't quite gotten to its blooming stage. But this is another one that, my bees really enjoy. It's one of the first things to bloom. So even though it's, bloom life is really short, it gets these really cool seed pods. It's a legume. And so they get these kind of rattly, big brown seed pods on them. And again, lots of architectural interest. So even, after everything has died, you still have this really cool, plant that adds structure to your garden, even, when it's cold and snowy and everything feels like nothing's ever going to come back to life. And so just so you can see how excited my pollinators are, if you go to the next slide, I have a little video to show you. So you can kind of see, my bees visiting it and kind of, they fly around. This is what I do. I'm a big nerd, so I go out there and chase bees with my phone camera. And all of these pictures I took from my phone. I have it in my back pocket all the time when I'm out there. So like, that's what I say about like plants should be fun. They should be engaging. Like I'm always out there looking to see what's happening. All right, next slide, please. So then we get to summer, and like Terry said, it is just, complete wealth of plants. Everything is exploding in bloom. You've got, bees on everything, butterflies everywhere. It's really, really great. Terry went over butterfly weed, and I can attest to the fact that it is just, there's always something on the butterfly weed. And I was kind of disappointed. I went back through my phone trying to find a picture, and I just didn't have any very good quality ones, but I have lots of really blurry pictures of, milkweed beetles and butterflies. I mean, it's just, there's always, like reliably 100% of the time I can go out to my butterfly weed and find something living in it. Another great one, Terry alluded to the beautiful foliage that's on this, in addition to the pretty, delicate flowers, Coreopsis. This is the native, but there are a bunch of different cultivars if you want slightly different colors. I'm not a complete purist. I try to have native ecotypes when I can, but if there's an interesting cultivar, I'm enough of a plant nerd that I'll, branch out a little bit. Next slide, please. Then some other, really heavy hitters for summer. Again, Terry, we have great minds think alike. Black-eyed Susans, I agree with you. I have to have them in my garden. It doesn't mind, or I don't mind that they spread enthusiastically. That way I don't feel guilty if I want to cut a big bouquet to have on my table. The more the merrier, and pollinators love them. This picture is a fly, and it's a bee mimic. So I did a double take. I was out there, doing my thing, taking a picture, and I was like, that bee looks kind of funny. And then I looked it up, and sure enough, it's a fly that mimics a bee. And then on the left, this is blue mountain mint. Mints are another some of you are probably cringing. You're like, I don't want to plant mint in my garden. It is incredibly enthusiastic and will spread. I have, I was really protective of my plant when I first put it in, and then it just went bananas, and now I'm ruthless. I just, it gets cut back every year. But it's one of those showstoppers. It might not be the most beautiful plant in your garden, but it is always, always, always going to be completely covered with bees. I go out there and they're buzzing around me because I'm in their way, and they're irritated that I'm blocking their access to their mint plant. So plus it smells good. And, as Jean alluded to, deer don't like aromatics. So, intersperse that in your garden and you can protect some of your other things. Next slide, please. The other plant that I think personally I like to have planted with my black-eyed Susans is Monarda, or bee balm. There are several different native varieties. There's the red bee balm that is kind of classic. There is Monarda fistulosa, which is like a light purple. That's also native. And then this is one of my new favorite plants. It looks like Dr. Seuss thought up a plant and was like, what is a weird flower going to look like? And then Monarda punctata. It's got these weird pink spotted petals. It gets kind of 3 layers, and bumblebees love it. I will go out there and there will be bees sleeping in the flower. And they're just so weird looking that it's one of those plants that draws you in. And it's not only beautiful to look at, like Dutchman's breeches are interesting and funny, but Monarda punctata will always have, bumblebees hanging around in there. Next slide, please. And then if you're like me and you have space to fill, I will advise caution with these two. Both of these plants, woodland sunflower and black cohosh, will get 5 to 6 feet tall, and they're spectacular, but they are very enthusiastic. My sunflowers, again, are something that bees are always on, very, very popular, very, very, very aggressive. So I tend to, again, have adopted a ruthless attitude to keep them where I want them to keep them. I will dig up any of the, the little plants that spread by rhizomes. Like Jean said, generally keep these at the back of your garden. I've learned from my mistakes. I was like, 5 feet tall, that's probably not true. And then I put them too close to the front and they flop over my path. So they got transplanted. But they are really, really fabulous. And black cohosh, again, will add it has these cool spiky flower, an interesting shape that you don't see. It's not a normal flat flower. It's just something cool to look at, add some texture. It's nice and tall and will, it's shrub-like. Everything will die back, but if you want to leave that up, through the winter, it's something interesting to look at. It gives your garden some architecture. Next slide, please. So before this one's playing, so I'll just talk over it. This is my last entry for summer, another really tall one. This is it will get 5 or 6 feet tall, and it's beautiful. It's covered with flowers. So my husband and I were walking through the National Arboretum, and it's a beautiful place. If you've been to the Arboretum, I hope you have. It's just a lovely walk, but it was really quiet, and we're used to our gardens where there's always a bird or a bee, there's always something flying by. And I just remarked to him, I was like, it's just really quiet here. There are no bees, there's nothing flying around. And then we turn the corner and there's this little tiny native garden with this spectacular plant there. And this is boneset. And it's kind of a swamp plant. It's a weed, but oh my gosh, it was just covered. Every single insect in the Arboretum was on this one plant at one time. And so, I included this video, and I'm sorry it's so small, to kind of drive home, this is what plants can do for insects. And this is a science experiment just sitting there. You can sit there with your kids can, see what butterflies are there, what, bees and flies and moths come by. It's just a really cool conversational piece. And so, I actually have this in my front yard because I'm crazy. But I'll sit on my front porch, and I've had friends come over and they just sit there and they're mesmerized because it's really cool. And I think, we kind of disconnect from this, plants and gardens should be immersive and they should be fun, should be stuff to look at. And boneset is a great example of one of those plants that's really cool to look at. Next slide, please. So as we get into late summer and fall, this is always kind of a bittersweet time for me because some of my favorite things bloom, but it means that the season is ending. So again, I like to have things that are fun. One of the most fun and weird plants in my garden is bottle gentian, and it's on the right. This plant is totally closed. The flower is totally enclosed. So pollinators have to break in, which means, big bees generally will just like bust their way into this plant to get to the pollen. So again, this is kind of a cool, if you have kids that are interested in gardening or, walking through the garden, you can say, look, these plants haven't, this flower hasn't been accessed yet. And then you can go back the next day, there'll be a hole in it where, the pollinator broke in. So that's kind of cool. And then on the left, this is blue mist flower. This plant grows absolutely everywhere. It freely self-seeds. So, I have one plant that spawned, many hundreds of babies that I've now transplanted throughout my yard. Again, I'm looking for economical ways to fill a lot of space. But again, it's got that kind of fuzzy flower that pollinators just love. It always has butterflies or bees on it. And in this picture, you'll see that's a grape leaf skeletonizer moth. And I use an app called iNaturalist. I snapped that picture. And actually for this presentation, I was like, gosh, I got to remind myself. You can take a picture and it helps you identify insects. So that's like if you're out there in your garden trying to see what's out there, that can really help. Next slide, please. And then of course, no fall garden is complete, in my opinion, without asters and goldenrod. They're kind of, I grew up in Michigan. These are plants that I grew up seeing, out in the fields and stuff like that. They're just so iconic in the fall. And if any of you know the botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer, she has studied the two. And in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about how the two colors, because she was like, gosh, goldenrod and aster are always out in the fields together. Why is that? Well, the colors are reciprocal. And so seeing these is pleasing to human eyes, and the same thing is true of bees. And so she's found that, you can have asters in your garden, you can have goldenrod in your garden, and both of those will attract pollinators. But if you put them together, they attract more. So they're more effective when they grow together. So they've kind of, evolved to be in the same place. So to me, when the asters grow, like, burst into bloom, they're another one that is completely like, especially my white kind of wild asters, they are just completely crawling with bees. Same thing with the goldenrod. It's like the last big fireworks show before the season winds down. So all of these are, again, they can thrive in sun, also part shade. If you have questions about deep shade, I'm happy to, to go there. And, if you go to the next slide, I'll show you the last, this is my last picture. Oh, sorry. Oh, I have my slides out of order. The two sources that I used, sorry, I'm going out of order, Becky. The two sources that I used mainly for this are Missouri Botanical Garden. They have a great, almost every single plant in my garden, cultivars, natives, everything, they have documented and have a really useful plant guide. And then Native Plants for Northern Virginia, plantnovanatives.org. They have some really helpful, quick start guides for, if you're interested in planting some native plants. And I'm not saying plant all native plants, but if you can intersperse a few here and there, your bees and butterflies will thank you. And then I think